March 1943. The North Atlantic in winter is not a place of mercy. The swells rise 20 feet, then 30, gray-green walls of water that roll without end beneath skies the color of iron. The wind cuts through wool and leather, through steel hulls and reinforced glass, through the confidence of men who believe the ocean belonged to them. For nearly 4 years, German U-boats had moved through these waters like predators in a forest they knew by heart. They surfaced at night to charge batteries and scan the horizon. They dove at dawn. They hunted in coordinated groups called wolf packs, guided by radio intelligence and the careful plotting of convoy routes. They sank merchant ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. But in the spring of 1943, something changed. Not all at once, not with a single battle or a single invention, but gradually, like the turning of a tide that begins imperceptibly and then becomes undeniable, the Atlantic began to turn against them. By May 1943, the most feared weapon in the Atlantic had become obsolete. This is the story of how the German U-boat fleet lost the war, not in a single battle, but through a quiet collapse that its crews felt long before Berlin admitted it. The U-boat crews noticed it first in small ways. The convoys they expected to find were no longer where they were supposed to be. The radio signals they transmitted to coordinate attacks were answered not by fellow submarines, but by silence, followed hours later by the distant rumble of depth charges. Aircraft appeared in skies where no aircraft should have been able to reach, hundreds of miles from the nearest land. And the coffee, strong, bitter coffee brewed in the cramped galley spaces of Type 7 and Type 9 submarines, began to taste different, not in flavor, but in meaning. It was no longer the coffee of hunters. It was the coffee of men who understood, without saying it aloud, that they were being hunted. The war in the Atlantic had begun with Germany holding nearly every advantage. In 1940 and 1941, during what U-boat commanders called the happy time, a single submarine could sink 5, 6, 7 merchant ships in a single patrol. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Britain imported nearly 70% of its food and raw materials by sea. If the convoys could be strangled, the island would fall without a single German soldier setting foot on English soil. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would achieve this goal. In the winter of 1942, his submarines came close. In November of that year alone, U-boats sank 119 ships totaling over 700,000 tons. The convoys sailed in clusters, each merchant vessel slow and vulnerable, protected by a handful of escorts that were too few, too poorly equipped, and stretched too thin across an ocean that seemed impossibly vast. But the men aboard those U-boats did not yet understand what they were facing. They believed they were fighting the Royal Navy and the remnants of a merchant fleet held together by outdated vessels and dwindling resources. They did not yet comprehend that they were facing the industrial capacity of the United States, a nation that had been attacked at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and had turned its entire economy toward war production with a speed and scale unprecedented in human history. In American shipyards, something unprecedented was happening. Liberty ships, basic cargo vessels designed for rapid construction, were being built at a rate of 3 per day. By the end of the war, American yards would produce more than 2,700 of them. Welders worked in shifts around the clock. Steel plates were prefabricated in sections, then assembled like pieces of a massive puzzle. The average construction time dropped from 230 days to 42 days. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was completed in less than 5 days as a demonstration of what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized. The U-boat commanders scanning the horizon did not know these numbers. They knew only that the convoys kept coming, larger and more frequent, no matter how many ships they sank. In the air, the advantage was shifting just as dramatically. Long-range patrol aircraft were closing what submariners called the air gap, that section of the mid-Atlantic where no land-based planes could reach. American-built B-24 Liberators, modified for maritime patrol, extended their range to nearly 2,100 miles. British Coastal Command deployed them alongside Sunderland flying boats and Catalinas. These aircraft carried depth charges, machine guns, and something the U-boats could not escape, centimetric radar. Developed in Britain and refined in the United States, this new radar could detect a surfaced submarine in darkness, in fog, in conditions where visual detection was impossible. The submarines that had once surfaced freely at night to recharge batteries now found themselves illuminated by searchlights dropped from aircraft they never saw coming. By this point, crews already knew the ocean had changed. The veterans who had survived the happy time tried to explain it to the new recruits, but words failed them. How do you describe the feeling of surfacing at night and knowing that somewhere in the darkness above, an aircraft might already be tracking you? How do you explain the sound of depth charges getting closer with each attack, more accurate than they used to be, guided by sonar that could hear your submarine's heartbeat? In the radio room, the technological war was being lost in ways the German High Command refused to acknowledge. Allied cryptographers working in cooperation between Britain's Bletchley Park and American intelligence services had broken the German naval Enigma code. Convoy planners could read U-boat operational orders sometimes within hours of their transmission. Wolfpack patrol lines were plotted on maps in London and Washington before the submarines even reached their positions. Convoys were rerouted around them. The U-boat commanders transmitted coordinates, assembled their forces, and waited for targets that never appeared. They assumed bad luck, poor intelligence, changing enemy patterns. They did not know their every move was being read by the enemy. High-frequency direction finding, huff-duff to the sailors who operated it, allowed escort ships to locate U-boats by triangulating their radio transmissions. Every time a submarine commander sent a message, even a brief one, Allied direction-finding stations plotted the signal. Escort destroyers converged on those coordinates. The ocean, which had once felt infinite and concealing, had become transparent. The U-boats were visible even when they thought they were hidden. At sea, the escorts themselves had transformed. Destroyer escorts and corvettes now carried improved sonar that could detect a submarine at greater range and with greater accuracy than the systems available in 1941. Depth charge patterns were more sophisticated, designed to bracket a submarine's likely escape routes. And the introduction of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, meant that convoys now traveled with their own air cover. These carriers launched Grumman Wildcats and Avengers that could patrol a 300-mile radius, hunting submarines that might be stalking the convoy from beyond visual range. This was no longer a battle. It was arithmetic. The Allies could produce ships faster than U-boats could sink them. They could build aircraft faster than submarines could evade them. They could train crews, deploy technology, and sustain losses at a rate that Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with a smaller industrial base, could never match. In March 1943, the numbers began to shift in ways that could not be ignored. Dönitz's submarines sank 21 ships from Convoy HX 229 and SC 122, a combined operation that seemed, at first, to confirm that the U-boats still held the advantage. But 40 U-boats had been required to achieve that result, and the cost in submarines lost and damaged was rising. In April, the Wolfpack sank 39 Allied ships. In May, they sank 34, but in that same month of May, 41 U-boats were destroyed. It was a loss rate the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. The German Naval High Command reviewed the figures and understood that a turning point had been reached. No amount of training could fix this. The newest commanders were as skilled as the veterans, sometimes more so, trained in the latest tactics, and equipped with the best torpedoes Germany could produce. But skill meant nothing when the enemy knew where you were before you knew where they were. Courage meant nothing when depth charges bracketed your position with mathematical precision. Experience meant nothing when the ocean itself had become a trap. There is a moment, recorded in the war diary of U-boat headquarters, that captures this realization. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The directive was brief and factual, a military decision based on operational necessity. But the men who received that order, sitting in submarines scattered across the Atlantic, understood what it meant. The wolf packs were being disbanded. The campaign that was supposed to starve Britain into submission had failed. The radio signals they transmitted to each other, once confident and coordinated, had become intermittent and cautious. The coffee they brewed in those galleys tasted like retreat. The human cost of the Atlantic campaign was staggering on both sides. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat fleet during the World War II, approximately 28,000 were killed and 5,000 were captured. It was a casualty rate of over 70%, higher than any other branch of the German military. The Allied merchant marine lost approximately 30,000 sailors, men who crewed the cargo ships and tankers that kept Britain supplied and the war effort sustained. They were civilian sailors, many of them middle-aged, who signed on for hazardous duty because the pay was better and because their nations needed them. When their ships were torpedoed, they died in explosions or fires or freezing water, far from home, and often without anyone knowing their names. By this point, new U-boat crews reported to their submarines knowing that statistically they would not return. The average survival time for a U-boat on Atlantic patrol had dropped to a single voyage. The coffee they drank before departure tasted bitter not because of the beans, but because of what lay ahead. They went anyway because orders were orders, and because the ideology they had been raised to believe in did not permit questioning the leadership that sent them. The turning of the Atlantic in 1943 was not celebrated with parades or public announcements. It was recognized quietly in operational reports and strategic assessments, in the statistics that showed fewer ships sunk and more U-boats destroyed. The convoys continued to sail. The merchant ships continued to carry food and fuel and weapons across an ocean that remained dangerous until the last day of the war. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The submarine campaign that was supposed to win the war for Germany had been defeated not by superior tactics or braver men, but by the industrial and technological capacity of nations that could produce faster than the U-boats could destroy. There is a broader truth embedded in this history, one that extends beyond tactics and tonnage. The Atlantic campaign was a contest between two visions of how modern war would be fought. The German vision relied on small numbers of highly trained specialists using advanced technology to inflict disproportionate damage on a slower, more vulnerable enemy. It was a vision rooted in efficiency, in the belief that quality and skill could overcome numerical disadvantage. The Allied vision, by contrast, was rooted in industrial democracy, in the belief that free societies could mobilize resources on a scale that authoritarian states could not match, and that ordinary men and women, given the tools and training, could accomplish extraordinary things. The coffee brewed in those U-boat galleys, bitter and strong, became a symbol of this contest. It was the same coffee chemically that it had always been, but its meaning changed as the war changed, from the drink of confident hunters to the drink of men who understood they were losing. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer a German lake. The convoys sailed with heavy escorts, air cover, and intelligence support that made Wolfpack tactics nearly suicidal. Dönitz continued to send U-boats into the Atlantic, hoping that new technologies, schnorkel breathing tubes, improved torpedoes, faster submarines, would restore the advantage. Some of these innovations arrived too late. Others were deployed in numbers too small to matter. The war had moved on. The tide had turned, not dramatically, but inevitably. Like the slow shift of ocean currents that no single man can see, but that every sailor eventually feels. The men who survived those patrols came home to a Germany that was collapsing, the cities bombed into rubble, and an ideology that had promised victory and delivered only ruin. Some of them wrote memoirs in the years after the war, trying to explain what it had been like to hunt and be hunted in the North Atlantic, to live for weeks in a steel tube beneath the ocean, breathing recycled air and drinking bitter coffee, and wondering if the next depth charge would be the one that crushed the hull. Their accounts are careful and factual, written with the emotional restraint of men who had seen too much to romanticize it. They do not glorify the war. They do not claim they were fighting for a just cause. They describe what they experienced, and they leave the judgment to history. History's judgment is clear. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies because they could build faster, innovate faster, and sustain losses longer than their enemies. The U-boat campaign failed because it was based on assumptions about Allied industrial capacity that were catastrophically wrong. And the men who fought on both sides, the submariners and the merchant sailors, the escort crews and the airmen, paid the price for decisions made by leaders who sent them into a war that could only end one way. The Atlantic in 1943 was cold and gray and indifferent to the men who fought upon it. It did not care who won or who lost. It simply rolled on, wave after wave, as it had for millennia, and as it will for millennia more. But for the men who survived those months, the ocean was never just water again. It was the place where the war turned, where the hunter became the hunted, where the coffee tasted like loss, and where the industrial power of democracy proved stronger than the ideology of those who believed themselves superior. The Battle of the Atlantic was not decided by courage or cruelty, but by factories, equations, and time. And time, in 1943, stopped working for the U-boats.